How much RAM do gamers need? It's a question we get asked a lot, and it's one that we used to answer on a yearly basis with a good old-fashioned benchmark video. The problem is the last time I bothered, the year was 2018, and I've been told that was quite a long time ago, so we really should make an updated video. So here we are, but before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ugreen and their new Nexode X 160-watt charger, their most advanced solution yet, featuring electronic stacking technology, enabling a more compact design that's both lighter and more powerful. In fact, it's 21% smaller than their original 140-watt USB-C version. With 4 ports, it provides fast charging via a trio of USB Type-C ports and a single Type-A port for a combined output of 160 watts. Allowing you to fast charge your laptop, mobile phone, and tablet at the same time. It also includes fast charging for MacBooks with the PD 3.1 protocol, allowing a single USB-C port to pump out 140 watts, and with Thermal Guard Protection System 2.0, it protects your devices from short circuit, over voltage, over temperature, and over current. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so in the past, I spent quite a few weeks benchmarking to answer the age-old question, how much RAM do gamers need? But this time, we're going about it in a different way, and for a few reasons. First and foremost, testing RAM capacities, well, it's tricky. Like with VRAM testing, a lack of memory doesn't always manifest in the same way. In the case of VRAM, FPS performance might tank, and this is the most obvious sign of trouble. That said, it can be a bit more subtle with occasional frame time spikes, or it might not impact performance at all, and instead just remove textures for a low quality presentation. With system memory or RAM, testing to see if an increased memory capacity improves performance is equally tricky, as going from say 16GB to 32GB is often more than just a capacity increase. Stuff like the operating frequency and timings, they're relatively easy to account for, but stuff like memory ranks can be difficult and in some configurations impossible to account for. It's a little bit like when someone upgrades from a 6-core Core i7 8700K to an 8-core Core i9 9900K and then claims that those extra 2 cores really boosted their gaming performance, when in reality the 33% increase in L3 cache is likely to have played a bigger role. And for a memory-related example, in the case of DDR4, we found when going from a pair of 8GB modules, which would be a single rank configuration, that there was quite often a significant performance increase when adding an additional 2 identical modules, even for games that didn't require more than 16GB of RAM. And this is because with just 2 8GB DDR4 modules, you end up with a single rank configuration, but with 4 modules, it becomes dual rank. And if you'd like to learn more about this, then we do have a dedicated video on the subject, and I'll link that in the video description. Now, a different approach would be to create a RAM drive, partitioning off a fixed portion of the RAM, and this should create the ideal scenario for testing different memory capacities while keeping everything else identical. This is something I will look into in this very video, but really the focus isn't going to be on benchmarks for this one. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't think a boatload of blue bar graphs is the best way to tackle this subject. But I guess I'll wait for your feedback to know if I was right about that. What we're going to do instead is fire up our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with a GeForce RTX 4090 installed and 64GB of DDR5 6000 memory, so an optimal high-end gaming configuration. And what I want to do is test a few dozen games to see how much RAM they actually eat up, as this will give us a really good idea of just how much memory you'll need for the latest and greatest AAA titles. And please note, I'm using an RTX 4090 as I don't want any assets spilling over from the VRAM into the system memory. As for background tasks, we have a few basic applications for monitoring system performance, game launchers such as Steam, and at idle the system was using 4.5GB of RAM. So let's load up over 30 games and play each one for 20 minutes to see how much RAM they use. There are clear signs here that 16GB of RAM is no longer optimal for playing many of the latest and greatest AAA titles, with over half a dozen pushing near or over that amount. Hogwarts Legacy is the most demanding example that we came across, but there were some other modern games such as The Last of Us Part 1 and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which were also very memory hungry. And I have to admit, I was also quite surprised to find Fortnite pushing past 16GB. All of that said, The vast majority of games tested will still run just fine with 16 gigabytes of RAM, though many of them do have very little headroom. So if you still have just 16 gigabytes of RAM and most of the games you're playing run just fine, well, that's not terribly surprising based on this information. But if you are trying to get into the latest and most demanding games with just 16 gigabytes, you might be experiencing a few issues. Again, all of these games were tested using an RTX 4090 with the highest quality preset enabled at 1440p. Okay, so let's do some quick testing with Hogwarts Legacy using the RAM disk software to partition off a fixed amount of system memory. Though for this first test we are running with all 64 gigabytes available. As you can see, the frame time graph is quite smooth, about as smooth as it gets in this game, and we're looking at 110 FPS on average with 1% lows of 51 FPS, though that number would probably improve across a 3-run average. Now, with half of the memory partitioned off, the game and system have access to 32 gigabytes, and here we see that performance is about the same with similar frame time results. And this is to be expected as previously we saw the system consumed 22 gigabytes in this title, so well within the available memory for this test. Now, retesting with just 16 gigabytes of available memory, we start to see some spikes in the frame time graph. It's not terrible by any means, but the game also isn't playing as smoothly, and if we play for an extended period of time, you will start to notice some very jarring traversal stutter. So for lower end systems, I think you could get away with 16 gigabytes, but for higher end stuff, you will without question want 32 gigabytes. Finally, just for fun, I reran this test with just 8 gigabytes of system memory available, and boy was it a bad experience, but really who's shocked? Even the average frame rate dropped here, but it was the 1% lows that tanked, and as you can see, the frame time performance is it's really bad. So bad that you don't need a graph to tell you that. So there you have it. For a gaming system, 32 gigabytes of memory is the sweet spot, and it should be plenty for the foreseeable future. There really isn't a need to go beyond 32 gigabytes for gaming. You're really just wasting your money at that point. Of course, if you're playing a game that you know needs a specific amount of memory, like Skyrim with a use all my memory mod or Chrome with 2 tabs open, so if you're doing something crazy like that, then you might need more than the typical amount of system memory. But for everyone else, 32 gigabytes is going to be plenty, and this is what we're recommending for gaming in 2024. For the most part, it is the default answer anyway for new system builders, as you really should be going with DDR5. And I suppose while you can get 16 gigabyte kits of DDR5, they do cost $60 US, and that really doesn't make sense because you can get a cheap 32 gigabyte kit for around $75 US, and that's a mere 25% premium for a 100% increase in capacity. Moreover, high quality DDR5 6000 in a 32 gigabyte kit, that can be had for around $90. So that's what we'd recommend. Now, I should just quickly note that if you're using a lower end GPU with, say, just 8 gigabytes of VRAM, for example, depending on the quality settings you're using, there is a chance some game assets intended for local video memory or VRAM end up overflowing into system memory, eating up your RAM. So if you're playing Ratchet & Clank, for example, and seeing more than the 14.7 gigabytes I reported for memory usage, there is a chance stuff like textures are spilling over into the system memory, and if that is the case, you'll want to dial down those quality settings. Another topic worth touching on is background tasks, as this can also increase memory usage. On my Office PC, for example, I had 2 instances of Mozilla Thunderbird running, several Chrome tabs across multiple accounts, Microsoft Excel, Photoshop, and then a few chat programs, and all up, that ate a combined 17.8 gigabytes of RAM. That's before I even opened up a game. So what happens if you're already using 17.8 gigabytes of your memory and you only have 32 gigabytes in total, but a game like Hogwarts Legacy that wants over 20 gigabytes? This is where Windows memory management comes into play. Programs that are deemed less critical or are given a lower priority end up in the Windows page file. Essentially, this sees them stored on your much larger, but also much slower local drive, probably an SSD. When this happens, if you Alt-Tab out of the game, you might notice opening something like a Chrome tab, which has been entered into the page file, is very slow to recall, creating a noticeably laggy effect. This can be a problem for those of you that like to chat with friends on Discord as you game or watch a 4K video in Chrome, which is a thing I've been told that many of you like to do while you game, and we observed the Discord app consuming between 400 and 500 megabytes when gaming. but this can vary depending on how many servers you have active, for example. Then with Chrome running just a single tab playing a 4K YouTube video, we found it used around 1.2 to 1.5 gigabytes. So if you want this stuff active while gaming, you can add around 2 gigabytes of extra memory usage to the numbers that I quoted previously. The good news is, as far as we can tell, even when playing the latest and greatest AAA titles with a reasonable degree of active background tasks, 32 gigabytes of RAM is still going to be plenty. So even for those users, our recommendation remains the same. All of that said, I'm sure there are those of you who are still interested in larger memory kits, as you can purchase 64 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 for $180 US, and that's pretty good really, though it's also somewhat of an expected price tag at twice the price of comparable 32 gigabyte kits. Anyway, some of you may still be questioning going with 64 gigabytes for gaming. After all, for a mid-range to high-end build, what's $90 US? And I guess fair enough if that's how you're going to approach it. The advantage of going with 64 gigabytes now is that you can do so with a pair of 32 gigabyte sticks, which should make achieving speeds like DDR5 6000 a lot easier. The disadvantage though being that right now we cannot find a single gaming example that requires anywhere near that amount of memory, so you are essentially wasting $90. Now, looking back to see what recent history can teach us about memory requirements of games, we did see some people recommending gamers buy 32 gigabytes of DDR4 back at the dawn of AMD's AM4 platform, claiming this was a future-proof approach that would offer a better experience. The problem with this though is, looking back, it was rather poor advice. That is assuming that you're not into wasting money. As we just saw, even today, most games will play just fine with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and this has been true for a long time now. Now, if we look at the value aspect of this, back in mid-2017, the cheapest DDR4 3200 16GB kits, they cost around $150 US, with the 32GB kits costing at least $260 US. Fast forward today though, and you'll find adding an additional 16GB of DDR4 3200 memory is going to cost you a mere $35 US. Meaning you're far better off buying the additional memory when you actually need it. Even if you happen to only have a dual DIMM motherboard, you can now purchase a 32GB kit for as little as $50 US. And even if we adjust for inflation over the past 7 years, that's still just $64 US, less than what you'd pay for a 16GB kit in 2017, and memory prices only got worse in 2018. So the point is, work out what you need now and just buy that. Unless going to the next tier makes sense, as in you're getting like double the capacity for well under twice the price. Really though, the answer is 32 gigabytes, and for those of you on older DDR4 platforms with 16 gigabytes, there is a good chance adding an additional 16 gigabytes will help smooth out frame time performance in the more memory hungry titles. And that is going to do it for this video. They don't all have to be benchmark marathons, and I don't really think boatloads of benchmark graphs is the best way to answer this question. But of course, do let me know what you think about that in the comment section below, and also let me know how much RAM are you running in your system at the moment, and do you feel like it's time to upgrade? Also, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't done that already, and we have Floatplane Patreon. Check out either one of those things if you want to get access to our exclusive Discord server, live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.